Today is Thursday, March 6th, 2025, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here again with my podcast co-host partner, Mr. Wallace G. Smith. How you doing, Mr. Smith?
I am doing fine, Mr. John Robinson. I appreciate you asking, and you're caring about my welfare.
I had a conversation with my wife this morning where I had to admit that despite the fact that Charlotte, North Carolina, has very mild and relatively short winters, I am so winter averse that I'm begging for the spring. I'm ready. It's here. It's slow. It's kind of here. I mean, the beginnings of the beginning of spring.
That's right.
Here.
We're seeing trees bud and everything. It's starting to look beautiful.
You would think I just spent a winter like in Montana or somewhere that had long winters. No.
And it was so mild here relative to this.
It really was. What do we have on our docket today?
All right. Today, straight up, we're going to talk about prophecy. We're going to talk about what we're seeing happen literally right now around the world, and we're hoping our youthful audience, so faithfully listening to us, we're hoping that from this you will kind of grasp that prophecy doesn't have to be something complicated. It doesn't have to be something just kind of mysterious, that really you can understand more than you think. And if you just kind of grab the fundamental basics of the arc of prophecy, the news and prophecy, it all comes alive, and what's going on today is these days, a very good example.
Let's discuss how it's coming alive and affecting our near future.
Let's do. Welcome back, and in particular, we thought Bible prophecy, well, we've actually talked about it a lot this morning. It's been on our minds in a lot of different ways, but Bible prophecy let us know if we're wrong, but especially if you're younger in the church, and Mr. Robinson would have some perspective. I know my wife has given me some perspective. It can seem kind of strange, and it can seem sort of distant and even sort of arcane and esoteric, especially when, and we're not saying there's not a place for these things, but my wife specifically mentioned, when you start talking about just kind of detailed things like, say, the 1,260 days versus the 1,290 days versus the 1,335 days in Daniel, and you start looking at these and you think, that's beyond me. That's so complicated, and you can. However, there is this more fundamental level of prophecy, which I would say in the end, as far as immediately applicable and helpful, and that is just simply understanding the arc of prophecy. That God's church has been blessed with an understanding of the arc of prophecy, how things are expected to develop from Christ's day up until the last days, that if you just get your feet wet and toes wet enough in that, it doesn't have to be very complicated. It doesn't have to be extremely detailed. In fact, I wrote in our notes that it might be fun one day, Mr. Robinson, to do a podcast titled something like Making Bible Prophecy Easy, something like that. And for our listeners who would at least like to jump into something, you could go take a look at Mr. Ames's booklet, which is literally titled Understanding Bible Prophecy. So that should be a clue that might be really helpful. But I will give Mr. Ames credit. He goes into more detail in the booklet, but still he would like to emphasize this overall basic idea that there are just some milestones. This idea that if you just kind of hit your wagon, so to speak, I'll say like I'm an 1800s person. I'm not sure who used to say hit your wagon. But if you'll just do that to some basic ideas, it's amazing. There's a certain peace of mind that comes over you when you're watching the news, but more than just peace of mind, a certain kind of understanding where you see something on the news and you can think, oh, well, we know that's going to eventually go in a direction like this. Or you're just like, ooh, well, that's not going to last long because we overall know this. And it's astonishing to me. It is comforting. And especially, Mr. Robinson, in what we're seeing today, we're seeing things happening today in the news, our current headlines, and not even on strange news websites, on our mainstream news. There are things the church has been talking about for decades, actually generations, I would say, and for which some people have mocked us. They've actively mocked us for taking some of the stands we do, and yet we're seeing those things. So it's exciting.
Well, Mr. Smith, I think one of the reasons this is particularly notable to me is growing up in the church, there were certain themes that were always very consistent. I'm talking about from the time I was in my teens paying any attention to what was going on in the world scene, although it was hard to ignore what was going on in terms of the Cold War and the Soviet Union versus the USA and two heavily armed camps. But what we're seeing now unfold, honestly, it's if we probably went back to its beginning, it maybe goes back a little further than this. But from the moment President Trump took office to 45 days later, today's 45 days in, the shift in Europe's stance and its relationship with the United States has taken a dramatic turn, which the church has always said. In other words, what was the kind of very big picture, simplified theme that the church has said for the last 40, 50, 60, 70 years is that eventually the United States was not going to be allied with Europe, that Europe was going to be, we didn't go into the detail, but something was going to happen, and the United States was going to do something onerous that got on
Europe is not going to like us.
Not going to like us, and it's going to force them to get together and form the final iteration of the end time.
Right. Mixture of iron and clay.
Exactly.
They don't get along all well, but they get along well enough to hate us.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing. It's like stunning. Kind of starting from when J.D. Vance went over and addressed the Europeans to where we are now, the shift has been incredible. And a big part of it has been Donald Trump's shift on Ukraine from what the previous administration was. He's like, hey, let's not be in a war with Russia. Let's get out of this war. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But Europe does not feel that way at all. I took a screenshot of the BBC News website this morning, and here's just some of the headlines. One of them here, U.S. destroying world order, Ukraine's ambassador to the UK says. Here's another headline. Zelensky and EU in show of unity as Russia warns against European troops in Ukraine. Why are we seeing that? Because Europe's thinking maybe they have to go it alone and fight Russia by themselves over in the Ukraine. I mean, we don't know how that'll unfold, but the U.S. isn't supportive of this war anymore, the current administration, and wants to get out of it, and Europe feels very different about it. We've seen, you and I both have seen articles about Germany now heavily rearming, something that was unthinkable even, how far back would you go? I was going to say even 10 years ago, that still seemed unthinkable. Younger listeners probably won't understand just what a big deal that is because of how World War II ended. It was baked into Germany's constitution that they wouldn't make. They were very limited in their war fighting capabilities and the arms they would make. But enough of my thoughts, Mr. Smith. What are you also seeing on the world scene?
Those are all good thoughts, and I'm seeing exactly the same thing. And that's what we hope to do today, is to give those who are listening to us some perspective in this regard. That if you're not careful, the moments can come and not be fully appreciated. Because it's just news and things like that. So wait a minute, step back and then ask, are these the things we've been talking about for literally years and years and years? And they do line up with that really well. So what I thought we would do today is look at 3 very specific things that seem to be happening in the world right now, and to make sure we do not miss the fact that we've been talking about these things for quite some time. You mentioned there, Mr. Robinson, about the references about concerning the actions that Mr. Trump has taken in the U.S. in just the last 45 days. Well, I can't recall if it was Mr. Weston's Holy Day letter that's coming out soon, or if it was actually one of the news and prophecy items worked with by Dr. Scott Winnale and Dr. Douglas Winnale and church administration, the people that work on those. But they were kind of commenting that Mr. Trump, even in his first term, was already pushing Europe to get more organized, to consider militarization, because they felt they could no longer trust the U.S. to defend them. For all of our younger listeners, you have to understand that at the end of World War II, even though the United States and Great Britain, the Allies, were with the Soviet Union, we all worked together to defeat Germany. You have to go back and look at the history after that it was very clear after that the world was now between, say, just roughly the United States representing the West more broadly, and then the Soviet Union, which now you would just say Russia, because the Soviet Union did break apart. When it comes to the West, there's all sorts of countries in the West, but the United States was the one at the end of World War II that had the most teeth. And their teeth grew so sharp and so great that Europe increasingly, especially after so much with Germany being a source of difficulty there, with even the UK, people getting used to the fact that, well, the US is going to step in and protect us. And what was the one the feeling of safety they had in NATO? Even NATO is this union of nations in Europe with the United States, this treaty that essentially, well, if the Soviet Union or Russia attacks, we'll band together and we'll fight back. But that was essentially, it became increasingly just the U.S. They're kind of like, wow, the U.S. is so powerful, and we have the missiles and the tech, and we're militarily supporting everyone for the most part. Not that other nations don't have their militaries, but they're relatively small because the United States military was so vast. Well, now you have a situation, and it really did at least begin with the first Trump administration, suddenly concerned that, well, maybe we can't count on the U.S. anymore. And if we can't count on the U.S., we've got relatively nothing. We just don't have it. I mean, some of the countries have their own nukes, et cetera, but still, in terms of actually pushing against an aggressor with the same strength the U.S. has. And then if other aggressors, whether it's China or Russia, non-Western nations, if they decide they want to attack, well, what kind of deterrence do we even have if we don't have the United States? So that again, I don't know if it was Dr. Scott Winnail or if it was Mr. Weston, but we're highlighting that really began in Mr. Trump's first term. Then you see with the Mr. Biden coming into power in the U.S., then suddenly kind of a sigh of relief amongst our allies. Like, oh, good, things are going back to normal. I would say the money's going to keep flowing, because that's another part of it, is the money flowing out of the U.S. But now not only is Mr. Trump back as president of the United States, but taking even far harder stands than he ever did, I'd say, in the first administration. And so, yeah, exactly what Mr. Robinson said. This idea of, and of course, Mr. Zelensky, the president of the Ukraine, is saying these kind of things because he's concerned about, he wants to drum up European support, now knowing that his European partners are getting wobbly knees because they don't see the U.S. being involved. And so what is this pressing people to do? Well, it's pressing exactly what we've talked about. So we're going to focus on three things, two of which are very related to these events we just said, but one of them also we are seeing, even if it doesn't seem directly related. I would say in a certain way it is, but not as directly related. Okay, the first thing we want to highlight that we have been talking about for years and years. We've been saying even back when Germany was in rubble, that for generations we've been saying, really, when you look at it, that Bible prophecy says that Europe will eventually arm itself again militarily into a war-making power, into a power that is capable not only of waging war, but war unlike what you see, what actually mankind will have seen before. So to me, the verse that pops into mind there is Revelation chapter 12. There's a lot we could read, and I definitely would recommend, if you haven't gone through Dr. Douglas Winnail and Mr. Rod McNair's booklet on Germany and prophecy, you ought to do it. I think they did a wonderful job with that booklet, and I think it helps make a great case for why Germany deserves our attention. But in Revelation chapter 12, we read, I keep saying Revelation 12. It's Revelation 13. So forgive me there, Mr. Robinson. Revelation 13. Do you see Revelation 12 in the notes and wonder why in the world was I doing that? Revelation 13. That's where I wanted to go. It talks about this massive beast, which is this political, military, economic powerhouse, which we teach is in Europe, and will rise in Europe. And in Revelation 13 and verse 1, it says, John says in vision that I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising out of the sea. Water often pictures kind of a mass of people, having 7 heads and 10 horns, on his horns 10 crowns, on his heads a blasphemous name. Don't worry too much about all of that in terms of those details. Just don't be, I got to keep track of all the horns and stuff. Just right now focus on the fact that it's a rising beast. Verse 2, it says, now the beast which I saw was was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear. His mouth was like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. It talks about seeing one of his heads how it had been wounded. I know all these points can seem like you kind of wonder, well, can I really grasp all this? Right now, don't worry about that so much. I want to focus on this detail. It says in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 4, so they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, who is able to make war with him? So this coming power, which we teach in the church, is going to be a rising, unified, though troubled Europe. And we have said this for even when Europe was as pacifist can get. We have said this is Europe. They will have the ability to wage war, and they will grow to where they have the ability to wage war in such a way that no one will feel competently they can even wage war against them. Well, what are we seeing now? We've been mocked. I've read people ridiculing us, saying, "Oh yeah, Europe is somehow going to do this. They've learned their lesson. They're pacifists. It's not going to happen." Let me just highlight. I don't even need to read the whole thing, but this article in the Telegraph, which is a British newspaper, and I say newspaper. I always see it online. It always feels weird now to say newspaper, but saying news screen just sounds stupid. That sounds stupid.
That's awkward.
It is awkward. So this is an announcement from the European Union, and this is Ursula von Leyen. She's currently the state head, if you will, of the European Union. And the headline says, the EU announces an 800 billion euro plan to rearm Europe and win over Trump in that sense. Now, I say win over Trump because in his first term, he was pushing Europe to arm itself, pushing Europe to start taking care of their own defense. Well, here they're kind of highlighting those things and saying, well, hey, okay, you say we're not tough. We'll tell you what, we're going to get tough. 800 billion euros. It's not quite 900 million US dollars. Billion. But it's getting close. It's like, I don't know, 860, 870 billion. I should have looked it up better. But you're getting close to 900 billion US dollars, which is what? That's just under a trillion. You're looking at just under a trillion US dollars. Now, you might think, well, the U.S. spends more than that on its military. Well, yes, we actually do. We spend a ton. But that's the thing. You've never seen Europe pouring this kind of money into its military, not in generations.
One of the other things I've noticed is just in general in the news coverage, just reporting overall what's going on and what people are saying is how hawkish, warlike many of the leaders of Europe are actually sounding. You know. That's the change of tone is notable. Is kind of my point there.
No, you're right. It was kind of funny because when things, if those who actually watched the news conference, it wasn't really a news conference, it deteriorated before that, but you had Mr. Trump meet with Mr. Zelensky about aid to Ukraine from the U.S. Before it all fell apart, apparently the plan was even to talk about British boots on the ground, quote unquote, and potential French boots on the ground in Ukraine, but they were planning on doing that with U.S. support in some form, and then suddenly the U.S. support isn't necessarily there, but they were talking about that. And you haven't really heard Europeans talking very assertively about actually placing soldiers in potential war zones outside of kind of UN peacekeeping kind of situations. It's very different.
Well, it believe it or not, and maybe this truly is just anecdotal, but for some reason it stands out to me more that President Macron and the French are sounding like this, because the French do, well, ever since Napoleon, kind of content within their own country to some degree, and I guess they fight when they have to, but they're not out there trying to conquer.
This is kind of a side quest here, and if we have any listeners in France, I hope you'll appreciate it, because one thing I admire about them is their national song, their national anthem. I don't know if you've ever heard it or read the lyrics or something, but it's kind of funny. At least the version I'm thinking of, and if we have any French listeners that can correct me that I'm thinking of the wrong song, let me know, because I am a very narrow-minded American and don't know as much as I should in many ways. But it is one of the most militaristic and violent, kind of national anthems ever. I mean, it's just really, really just kind of pugilistic. It's very fascinating.
I have found some data for us, Mr. Smith.
Data? Well, I have to like data.
It actually, I think, nicely contextualizes the almost $900 billion in spending that Europe is talking about doing. Okay, so top 10 nations in the world by military expenditures as of 2023. And so this seems to be per an annual spending. Okay. No shock, the United States is number one. How much did they spend in 2023? $916 billion. Wow. So you could say that Europe collectively is talking about spending as much on their military as the U.S. spends on their military. So that's actually quite noticeable. And so that's only 3.4% of the U.S. gross domestic product, but 37% of all spending in the world. So of all the dollars spent on the militaries, the United States spends 37% of all the spending. China is second at $296 billion. Russia is $109 billion. So we spend almost nine times as much as Russia on military spending. Then the first European nation that shows up is sixth, the UK at $74 billion. So the amount that the U.S. military spends is staggering. And so to me also, Mr. Smith, that makes it all the more notable. So as of right now, most people would say, even casual observers of geopolitical events, well, who's the most powerful military in the world? Well, that's the United States. And if you're even more knowledgeable, the amount we spend, the equipment we have, and the technology available to the U.S. military outstrips most other nations, and some nations by a lot. And so right now you could say, well, who could win a war against the U.S. military? So for that prophecy to say that the beast that's going to rise up in this collection of nations, and I'm glad you pointed out that it's a mix of it's an economic system.
Right,
it's also it's an economic. If you had to pick one thing, what's it? The main thing? It's economic first, and maybe political second, military third, frankly. But that's just my opinion. How quickly the script is going to flip. We're going to go from who can fight against the U.S. military to this European juggernaut that's going to appear on the scene. Most indications are relatively quickly. It seems like it'll kind of take people by surprise a bit, and who can make war with it, and no mention of the distant second,
Right.
So
right. That is good data there, Mr. Robinson. Now, the one thing I don't recall is what Miss Lyon may have said was that, I don't know how, like, over what period of time that 800 billion euros might be released. But if I recall, it was not like, you're not looking at multiple decades. You're looking at a certain amount of time. There's I don't know if I actually have a quote from that, but there's other talks where they see that a certain emergency situation actually frees up some funds that normally would is kind of bound to go in other sort of directions, but under certain conditions, they're allowed to direct that in directions like these new directions. We have the News and Prophecy publication that we have from February 28th. So actually just a week or two ago. I thought actually was very interesting. We have this comment here summarizing some news items, actually mainly pulling from an MSNBC article, February 17th. It says a former German defense official stated, "The question that is important to everybody is, can we trust the United States of America?" Ukrainian President Zelensky, also present at the meeting, urged, "We must build the armed forces of Europe so that Europe's future depends only on Europeans and decisions about Europe are made in Europe." It continues, the News and Prophecy item. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced that she will, quote, this is it, quote, activate the escape clause for defense investments. That is, like, they've got these kind of things built in that it says allowing EU nations to overspend their EU legislated budget caps in the name of defense. That is part of the massive, because it is a giant regulatory body. They love regulations. And so they've put these caps on how much you can spend on defense. And now she's saying, well, no, we're going to trigger the escape clause, and we're just going to lift the lids and let countries spend more than they were supposed to. It continues, finally, German CDU head Friedrich, I'm just going to say Friedrich now, Merz. Now, he is actually the chancellor now, and it highlights that he's been selected to become the chancellor. I think that actually that transition has happened, but he was already commenting about Germany's future in Europe, and here's what Merz said. "I fully agree with those who are demanding leadership from Germany. And frankly, I'm willing to do that because I'm seeing that Germany is in a strategic position at the center of Europe, that so many things in Europe depend on Germany."
Fascinating.
It's just astonishing to see the very things we've been talking about and see them happen in your own news items.
That matches, that's an added detail that matches what I heard in the church growing up 40 years ago, 40 years ago. And that was, Europe, but also Germany. Germany was the heart of it. And of course, that's not We also think that there's a certain very large religious organization centered in Rome that
Yes,
it'll be
yes.
a big part of it as well.
I'll we'll wrap up this because the second point is very similar to the first, and so I think I can wrap up this point with a few other talking. It's just sort of news items, if you will, and then actually move one of the things I was going to use to support this to talk about more in the next one. Mr. Weston has a Holy Day letter coming out. Be sure and read that when you get it. He sends a letter on the spring Holy Days and a letter with the fall Holy Days. It's how we get our green envelopes in the letters. And he comments in that one, speaking also of Chancellor Merz. Or again, I need to double check. I think he is currently Chancellor now. I know they had the election, but I think he's actually handed over. It says Merz said that the endeavor of trying to become independent of the United States, the endeavor was so urgent that he was not sure that in the Transatlantic Alliance Leaders Summit in June, that is in June, they have an alliance meeting coming, the transatlantic, so leaders in Europe, but also the U.S. coming together for a summit in June. He wasn't sure whether, quote, they would still be talking about NATO in its current form, or whether we will have to establish an independent European defense capability much more quickly. And then I grabbed an item from the BBC where he also said, in view of the threats to our freedom and peace on our continent, the rule for our defense now has to be whatever it takes.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's just amazingly serious positions being taken that, again, I feel like we've been talking about forever. And it's just exciting to see.
Well,
I mean, it's kind of spooky because but at the same time, it's just exciting to see.
Yes.
Okay, the next point. I would make myself move on. The next point is very much related because, it would be because I feel like in Mr. Trump's first term, it's all about the money to a certain extent. It's like, hey, look, we're paying to defend you guys. You guys are doing nothing. You guys are putting nothing in your own military. You need to start picking up your end of the bargain. You need to start doing this. Well, you say all of that, and sure enough, there was talk. It was with the invasion of Ukraine, which admittedly was after Mr. Trump's term. That's when you had the then president of Germany saying that's when they decided to spend 101 billion euros or something like that toward, I think it was, I might have been the conversion to dollars, but about 100 billion euros towards defense in Europe. And the news items at the time were saying that when he said that, there were gasps in the German legislature that he would actually even say out loud, we need to spend about 100 billion euros on our military. Now you go 4 years later from that, well, roughly, you have the head of the EU talking about 800 billion euros, and people are thinking, oh, yeah, maybe. Yeah, Well, part of why Mr. Trump was doing that because, it's about the money. Hey, we're not footing the bill for everybody. What's going on, right? Well, now it's different because when it's your allies, well, hey, I want strong allies. It's like, hey, I love you guys. Why don't you build up your missile defense? Why don't you build up your militaries? Don't just make us shoulder the burden. But that's when it's your allies. Prophecy also says that America's allies will eventually radically turn against them and distance themselves from America, and they will no longer be allies.
Is there a sense that it's a rapid shift?
Well, that's actually a really good question. I like to defer to what Mr. Weston likes to say that well, quoting from, I think The Sun Also Rises. I think it's that book. But he talks about going bankrupt. The guy said, "Oh, yeah, it happened slowly and then suddenly."
Yes.
And I feel like kind of like when the housing crisis happened, in 2008, the financial crisis, where you had all these bad loans going out for houses. And then suddenly in 2008, it's like the bottom drops out, and suddenly the financial system wasn't ready for this, and it's a huge shock. You have under Mr. Bush towards the end of his term passing this gigantic aid package, and Mr. Obama kind of picks up the baton and keeps going. And everyone talks about how sudden that felt, but I remember myself reading articles in the Financial Times, which makes me sound super fancy, but I did have a subscription to the Financial Times out of London at the time for years leading up to that, talking about how this is a problem, this isn't healthy,
right,
this is going to be bad. And then when it suddenly happened, it's like, wait a minute, this wasn't sudden. This was kind of clear. Well, it's sort of the same thing here. I feel like it's the kind of thing, and we'll look at a few statistics where I think people will see that sentiment was turning, and then next thing you know, it is going to feel very sudden about how absolutely that's just my take. But again, to highlight, we're not talking about the news. We're talking about Bible prophecy itself saying that America's allies would eventually turn against her. And the passage I thought I would pick for that was in Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 30. And Jeremiah 4 and verse 30 is kind of looking after the fact, sort of. You talk about the tribulation, things happening. But in Jeremiah 4 and verse 30, we see God saying here through the prophet, and when you are plundered, now he's speaking to the house of Israel, which primarily is the U.S. and Britain in this sense. In this particular, Israel is more nations than that. But in terms of the two nations and peoples that are taking the brunt of the tribulation, that's the U.S. and Great Britain. And he says there, when you are plundered, what will you do? Though you clothe yourself with crimson, though you adorn yourself with ornaments of gold, though you enlarge your eyes with paint, in vain you will make yourself fair. That is, you try to look as attractive as you can. You start putting on the old clothes. Essentially, you're tarting up, it would say. You're starting to kind of look like you're amorous and like hey, don't you still want me? Look how beautiful I am. God is really playing. He continues, says, even though you do all of these things to look as attractive as possible, like you used to do, it says your lovers will despise you. And more than that, he says they will seek your life. That is, you think all your lovers are going to come to your aid. And Israel used to do that. Israel would, instead of appealing to God, they'd cozy up to Egypt. They'd cozy up to all these.
And they sometimes would spend a lot of money doing it.
Yeah, because that's how you win allies. Really, and my wife brought this up this morning, that we talk about all the news with Mr. Trump and USAID or USAID, however you want to say it, and how he's wanting to cut off the spigot, because his money has been flowing. And Mr. Robinson and I were talking this morning that you would have to be in pure delusion to not think that when trillions of dollars are going out the door, there's not some form of graft.
Right.
That's just human nature. Yep. You don't have to assume anything completely conspiratorial to assume, people are using that for weird purposes.
I remember, of all people, Bill Maher, and this was several years ago.
Yeah, the liberal former comedian, talk show guy now, yeah.
And he was talking, he said, look, we all know the system is kind of corrupt, but how much corruption can we stand before the whole thing collapses? Exactly. I was like, what an astute observation. I appreciate it.
Exactly. Well, so we think now that is U.S. money has been both it's kind of like a blessing and a curse. Curse wise, we've been funding, say, for instance, LGBTQ programs in nations where the government doesn't want the growth of that culture. They actually don't want that. But on the other hand, we've been funding a lot of things, not only just things that with graft you can enrich the leaders of those countries who kind of take their cut off the top, but frankly, other programs that countries have been dependent on. We've had an American peace. We wrote a whole article on it. It's a cover article about the Pax Americana.
Who wrote that?
I don't know, some guy, some schmo. But we've had an article on that, and part of what we've done is we've won friends with our money, with looking like the most beautiful prostitute on the block. And you bet countries want that money to keep coming. You bet they want that. But now we're turning off the spigot. And in the end, you discover they weren't all your friends because of some shared values. They were your friends because you had the money. Yeah. And so there's a lot. My wife was the one that pointed out this morning. But there are values come into play, a lot of different things. I could cite Mr. Weston's comments again if I go back, the ones I didn't read. I was talking about Germany electing their new leader, Merz, and how he was already working to continue what the BBC called, quote, a seismic shift in transatlantic relations. That is, they are the world used to see as Europe and the U.S. standing together, and they are not as interested in doing that anymore. There was a poll taken. Now, this was actually not long after Mr. Trump was elected. This is before everything else. But YouGov did a poll of the sentiment of different European countries.
Okay, so I saw your note in here, and I assumed this was after President Trump came in.
Okay, and it is. It's actually right there. It's right about the time he came in. And so they compared. Well, you know what? Actually, I need to revise that. They took this poll in February of 2025
and compared it to August 2024.
And in between that is sentiment that was in November. So around the time of the U.S. election. And you see a trend, and the trend is the same for each country they talk to. In Denmark, and the question was, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of the following countries? And this was their answer concerning the United States. The people in Denmark, actually, well, I save them for last. Start with Italy.
Okay.
Favorable view of the U.S. Just only a handful of months ago, really. Towards the end of 2024, 48% down to 42%. In Spain, 51% to 43%. Britain, it's our brother country, our sibling, 49%, so positive, but down to 37%. France up at 50%, half of the French, down to 34%. Germany, 52%, so generally leaning favorable. 52% having a favorable view, now down to 32%, a little less than a third of the country. Sweden from 49% down to 29%. And then finally, Denmark, they polled, was at 48% before, having a favorable view of the U.S., so about half, but down to 20%. Only 1 out of 5 people having a positive view. Now, that's a tiny thing. And then, we talked to Mr. Wojciech. Mr. Wojciech highlights how even Canada up north is having a surge of people not. I think some people were happy at first because they were unhappy with their prime minister. But Mr. Trump's comments about Canada as a whole nation,
Right.
That's kind of how you
Yeah.
turn away even the people who do love you.
Even if you're supportive of some of Mr. Trump's policies, because in theory, who wouldn't want to uncover corruption and make sure we're using our money smartly? There's things he's doing that I don't think it's too difficult to be supportive of. But man, the one area I thought, having some Canadian friends, even if I may say so, calling them the 51st, like I can't think of a more offensive kind of slur, if you will, to Canadians other than, hey, you guys want to be the 51st state?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if we mentioned it in a previous podcast or not, but I knew a fellow when I used to work with as an actuary, not in the church, but as an actuary. And he worked with Canada. And he let me just be upfront. I'm not judging his heart, but let's just say everyone who knew him perceived him to be a jerk. And it was an older fella. You could tell he didn't really care about him. And he actually had a sign on inside his cubicle that labeled Canada the 51st state. And I thought, why do we even have him working with them? Because he's clearly kind of antagonistic. So I 100% get that. Well, here's an example of kind of what's going on and kind of what's, I would say, even a certain spirit in our country right now. And if any of you happen to see Mr. Trump's address to Congress recently, he was invited by the House Representatives to speak before a joint session of Congress, and he was talking about some of the waste that they say they have uncovered that's been going out, and he mentioned a large number of millions of dollars going from the U.S. to, I'll just right now say a certain country because I want to make my point by not saying it yet.
He did not pronounce it correctly.
He did not. So, and I've read that there's multiple pronunciations, but I don't think he hit either one of those.
I have mine from a native of the area.
Oh, great. Okay, then we're going to defer to you when the time comes, so you better get it right. Okay. So he talked about the millions of dollars, supposedly, and it's been disputed, but this is what he said, going to this country to support LGBTQI plus, programs. Well, if you actually look at it's a country in Africa. If you look at the country's laws, they have moved a little bit in that direction, but they still don't legalize same-sex, quote-unquote, marriages. You get the impression that culturally, they're not in favor of moves in that direction. I mean, I don't know if I'm right or not, but that's kind of what I look at their laws, at least. I look at where they are because I did take a look. And I can imagine some people from that country, because the president of the United States makes a speech, the news gets around, and they might be thinking, yeah, why is foreign money coming in to support this program in my country? I don't want it. I'm so glad that Mr. Trump is kind of turning it off dry. So, but he said something else as well. So what was the name of the country there, Mr. Robinson?
Lesotho.
So is that how the natives say it? Lesotho? All right. So Lesotho, am I saying it right? Mm-hmm. Well, what did he have to throw in there?
You would think it's pronounced Lesotho.
You would, because if you're an American and don't know. I did look it up in the dictionary to try to make sure I got it right. And I also got, it did actually suggested one pronunciation as Lesotho, but it did also mention Lesotho. So, okay.
So maybe there is a bit of a variance in it, maybe from one area. I mean, we have lots of words that get.
Well, at the same time, it's an
pronounced
English dictionary, so it's often going to give you how people are saying it in your country. But that said, he insulted them as he said it. He says, like, no one knows where that is. He says, nobody even knows about that country. And I've actually read that, well, they were offended. You know, the leader of the country is offended. Like, well, this is not, you know. So why do you also have to do that? Well, to a certain extent, because everybody laughed when he said, "I'll say everybody." You know, the Republicans certainly did in the meeting, and there's a certain spirit of that in America right now. Like, yeah, we don't have to care about you guys. You know, it's like finally, you know, we're getting to be the big man we know we are.
We only need to know one language.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you have this sense, and again, we ought to get disclaimer guy on just to make sure. In fact, you know what? I am going to pull disclaimer guy just to make sure you know. We're not taking a political stand on this. We're trying to highlight the implications for prophecy. So disclaimer guy, bring your manly voice and help everyone to know what we're looking at here.
The Living Church of God does not involve itself in politics. Any resemblance between the comments that follow and getting involved in politics is purely coincidental, or is a figment of your imagination. Control yourself.
Thank you, disclaimer guy, because you can't talk about world conditions without mentioning politics, but we are not taking a political position. Mr. Robinson, you had an observation while he was talking.
So that's exactly right. What are we doing? Well, we are told to watch world events, but we okay, I can only speak for myself. In my late teens, when CNN became a 24-hour news channel, I was fascinated by it, and it made me pay attention to politics. And of course, I grew up in a very conservative family in Texas, which was generally historically been a fairly conservative state. And but you can just drive yourself crazy analyzing the now daily news cycle and try to infer something prophetic out of it. In other words, when we try to, even if you just go year by year, try to analyze if we've fulfilled any prophecy, that doesn't really work. Every time we've speculated.
Yeah, that's definitely not the way to go. Right.
We think we see a new leader replaced by, and a leader replaced by a new leader, and we think, well, maybe something's going to happen. Then, like 20 years later, it's kind of like, yeah, I guess nothing happened there.
Right.
You know?
Right.
But one thing the church, we've said this before on the podcast, growing up, I remember this. We always said that Germany would be reunified. And so if you're younger and maybe you don't love history so much, after World War II, Germany was split into two nations, Western Germany and Eastern Germany. And Western Germany was generally controlled by, well, it depends on how you look at the divisions, but the U.S., England, and France kind of controlled Western Europe, or Western Germany, and the Soviet Union controlled Eastern Germany, and they had no interest in ever letting that go. But we said, to fulfill prophecy, ultimately, that Germany most likely had to be
something's
reunified.
got to happen. Yeah.
So we've always said that. And sure enough, was it because of our incredible watching of world events that we predicted? No, the opposite. When the Soviet Union collapsed, and then the force that was keeping them apart disappeared, and they were reunified. Well, we always said that was going to happen. But you know what the rest of the world said? Nobody said that. In fact, I remember some of the discussions at the time was one of the greatest intelligence agency failures ever. How did nobody predict that Germany?
And how did nobody know this was about to happen when that was the largest political event of the year, if not the decade? I mean, that was huge for the Berlin Wall to come down, and yet the intelligence agencies were completely caught flat-footed.
So what's our point? Part of the point is, don't get distracted by the news cycle that constantly churns out new things. Watch for big picture signs. And a big picture sign is a Europe that's distancing itself from the United States, kind of coalescing into its own, I was going to say entity, maybe that's not the best word for it, but its own political force that's now making decisions outside the United States and about to spend $800 billion on a military, which would match U.S. spending. Now, that's notable.
It is very notable. That's such a good way to put it, Mr. Robinson. In fact, this last point of the three might be a good way to illustrate what you're talking about, given the details of what's going on the ground. So the third thing we wanted to highlight, and we won't have as much direct news about this. This is a lot more anecdotal, definitely what I'm seeing on social media. Though there is definitely some news, and that is this: that talk about the overall arc of prophecy, not in the getting into the weeds or a lot of details. Bible prophecy says that counterfeit, false Christianity will experience a huge surge in popularity. That is, it's been very easy, say, to be tempted in the last many years, maybe even decade or so, to think that the forces that persecute us are going to be atheistic, kind
Right.
of woke.
Yep.
When that's not the Bible's picture. The Bible's picture is that people will actually believe they're serving Jesus Christ, they're serving God, and they will believe it. Literally, Jesus says they believe they're doing God a service by persecuting true Christians. So that is the arc of prophecy. Now, here's where I think Mr. Robinson's insight is really helpful. The current Pope, Mr. Francis. Anyway, Pope Francis, the current head of the Roman Catholic Church, is not in the healthiest of states. He was actually elected as Pope. Some people don't realize they do elect their Pope.
No,
There's some helpful videos out there about that. And I would say that was about the time you, Mr. Robinson, started laying out the magazine and being our kind of directing our art efforts, if I recall, was about that time.
Right. No, exactly. I'll probably always remember that in part because of what the cover was. But when we decided it was time to update our look and we finished our new template and built the first magazine, it had Pope Francis on the cover. This is the brand new cover. So then that was over 10 years ago.
Yeah, it was. That's right. So you have Pope Francis was elected, and so many people were kind of caught up in that heathen Malachi prophecy, not the book of Malachi, but this other prophecy about, is this the last Pope? Is this the guy that the heathen have prophesied, would be the last Pope? And of course, we're always going to wonder if it's hey, I tell you, when he starts calling fire down from heaven, I'm definitely going to think that's the guy. But
that would be notable.
That would be very notable. And so it's easy to get caught up in that. But you know what? Talking about the big picture, Mr. Robinson saying, let's say, because Pope Francis, I got my pop on the microphone there. Pope Francis has been notable in one particular respect, which is, I'm not trying to say this to insult the man, but I will say that someone else has said, and it gives some perspective, have called him Frank the Hippie Pope, because he has been, by some measures, one of the least Catholic popes that they've had. He if anything, when people want to go back to the old ways and they want to have the Latin Mass again, and like the Harrison Butker speech that we talked about, he's been the opposite of that. He's been like, no, you're just hanging on, we need to kind of move forward. He's put things out there that make the church seem a little more accepting of homosexuality, accepting of this, kind of walking a line. Well, there's quite a bit of disagreement inside the Catholic Church right now. There's a lot of hardliners who actually at this point are kind of done with looking to Pope Francis to make the church what they want it to be, and they're looking to see who comes next. They're rooting for certain guys possibly that might be Pope after him, and with his health as shaky as it is, who knows? But let me get this out because I want to support your point, and that is that not everything hinges on who the next Pope is. Just like even some presidents we've had, the guy could be Pope and then 10 days later not be Pope anymore, because there have been some very short terms where someone just didn't last, whether, I'm not saying it was always foul play, but you have short terms. Prophecy doesn't hinge on who the next Pope is. Prophecy is what prophecy is. So focus on the larger picture. And in that sense, I do think we see the larger picture coming to fruition these days.
Right. So, okay, that leads me into a question I wanted to propose to you that might help our audience. One thing you emphasized about maybe a year ago that really hit with me was the importance of making a distinction about conditions. So like the Bible describes certain conditions, but true signs. And maybe conditions isn't even the way to put it, but we can read through Matthew 24 and it talks about a lot of things, and we can watch for it. We can watch for things like wars and rumors of wars, but those aren't inherently signs. Signs are very specific things. The Bible says, watch for this. And one example is when you see the army surround Jerusalem, when you see the abomination, that's a clear sign. It doesn't require interpretation. I thought maybe you could just talk a little bit about the importance of watching for real signs versus just kind of like for example, I almost you took the conversation in a different direction, but I was about to say, well, my prediction, and I mean prediction, definitely not prophecy, but based on my watching of world events and what I think I've learned about Catholicism and how the papacy of Francis has been taken, I would predict a big shift back to a more conservative pope. But that is truly that is a great example of me just interpreting world conditions and trends and picking something I think is going to happen. That's very different from an actual biblical sign, isn't it?
Okay, wow, that's not just because you asked me about it. That's a great question, Mr. Robinson. It really sort of that is worth a clarifying kind of point. Yeah, here's an example of conditions versus a sign. Like conditions we kind of talked about earlier. Seeing armies surrounding Jerusalem, about to bring an abomination of desolation stuff. That's clearly a sign. Jesus literally says, "When you see this," right? That. On the other hand, conditions would just be Europe interested in arming again. Suddenly Europe, because you can't have armies to surround Jerusalem unless you have a continent willing to actually manufacture and create those armies. And conditions are the kind of things that can ebb and flow. Like you can have, let's just say a hypothetical future here. What if all of a sudden, United States changes its mind? I don't have no idea what could happen, but let's say suddenly it's like, you know what? We were just kidding. In fact, we're going to go into Ukraine. In fact, we'll just take care of it, guys. Well, then Europe might go, oh, good. We really wanted to spend that $800 billion on something else. We wanted to spend it on more Belgian chocolates. Ooh, it's very good, by the way, very good chocolate. Whatever it is they wanted to spend it on. Well, then that would be a lessening of the conditions, right? So no, we really are talking about prophesied conditions that need to be in place for prophesied circumstances. So I would say, yeah, a sign, that's a good example. Like in this case, here we're talking about a resurgent interest in kind of the counterfeit Christianity. Not about, I don't want to go to church. No, like, let's go. It's Sunday. Let's all go to church. Let's all, let's say, hey, it's Friday, let's not eat meat, let's say whatever it is, a real passion in a world that has been increasingly secular. Well, that's conditions, right? When suddenly people, like I'm seeing on Twitter all the time, I see the discussions someone we're calling Catholic bros, or Protestant bros or this or that, where we literally had our own vice president citing quote unquote church fathers, and trying to make a point about you haven't seen that level of dialogue. There is clearly an increasing interest in Christianity, quote unquote Christianity. In fact, I did look, there's a Pew study, Pew, the research organization, that they say after years of decline, the Christian share of the U.S. population stabilizes. They say stabilize. But honestly, when I take a look at that, going back since it looks like in their figures 2022, I see an uptick. I see an increase in interest in those who actually think, you know what, I might call myself a Christian. I don't want to look into that. I've looked at, Barna has done polls and shown that millennials and Gen Zers are increasingly interested in trying to know more about Jesus. There's a growing thing. Well, that's conditions. Sign, like you mentioned, that would be a pope or false prophet otherwise calling fire down from heaven. Someone who preaches devilish doctrines that sound Christian but are not, who literally pulls, and those are called signs. So that would be the difference. There's one thing to look at conditions, and there are conditions that are in favor of prophecy happening, and there's conditions that are not in favor. Now, if they're not in favor, that doesn't mean prophecy won't happen. God's word is always going to happen. But the conditions, like if the United States was super strong and super healthy and let's just say super moral, well, that's not conditions in favor of kind of a downfall, right? It could still happen really fast. But then there's conditions where we're looking weaker, we're getting separated from our allies. Yep. Now you're looking at favorable conditions. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think that was good. I think, maybe we could even, you talked about maybe doing some more prophecy-based podcasts in the future just to try to help the younger members of our audience get
to not be down. Intimidated, yeah.
And knowing the difference between, I want to use the word signs. I'll even put it this way and try to clarify. There's a lot of signs at the end of the time, but actually that's not correct. There's a handful of very specific signs as the Bible defines them, and then there's a whole lot of stuff that seems to just be context kind of.
Right. Mr. Armstrong used to say with Matthew 24, he liked to boil that down to one sign. And that was the gospel being preached to the entire world. He really felt. And then Christ says the end will come. And so yeah, there is that difference there, and we do want to be careful about that. And I probably ought to cut off there in terms of, but I hopefully what Mr. Robinson and I have talked about here, it was encouraged you. I know it can really seem that, prophecy seems so obscure. There's so many, these kind of arcane details here and there. Like, was it 2.5 years plus 1 year? Is it 3.5 years? And honestly, if you're feeling intimidated by prophecy, that's not the way to jump in and start to learn. Just talk to friends, talk to your parents, talk to your pastor. Look at our materials where we talk about the basics of prophecy, the overall arc of what to expect. And we do have materials. Definitely jump in, read those materials. You need to understand why the United States and Great Britain are Israel. You need to understand why we say Germany plays the role it does. Definitely look at our booklets. But if it's just a matter of understanding what's going on in the news and wanting to look at the world through a certain kind of prophetic set of glasses, if you will, then really all you need to start off are some of these fundamental basics. And these days, at least for the last month or two or so, if you do look through those glasses, you start to see some excitement in the news because you see those kind of prophetic conditions. Yes. It's almost like they've never been. I just can't say never. Like we haven't seen a ripeness in prophetic conditions like we see today in ages.
What a good way of putting it. I was trying to think of a way I could summarize it so that it seemed really, really big picture to our listeners. And we know that there's a prophesied end-time Babylonian system called the beast, essentially. I mean, there's several ways you could refer to it, but that's one of them. That's going to arise, and it's going to dominate the world, and that's going to be the end of things right before Christ returns. So why don't we see it arising? Well, since World War II, I think it's fair to say that Europe has been essentially under the U.S.'s thumb this whole time. And so for them for the beast system to arise, they need to not be under the United States thumb anymore. And what we're seeing is not only does that appear to be happening, but the United States itself, through President Trump's policies in particular, I think we could be that specific, is pushing them to do it. He's saying, look, we're tired of footing the whole bill. You guys need to pay your own way. Oh, by the way, we don't really support that war over there in Ukraine anymore, which certainly, if you lived in Europe, you would care more about than the United States. And
it feels like their backyard to them.
Yeah. And they're getting nervous about it, and they're thinking it looks like we're going to have to go our own more and not count on the U.S. anymore. Now, that's, like I said, that's something that you and I are like, wow, we now actually are beginning to see the conditions that would allow the beast to arise, whereas up till now, there's really no movement on that because of the dominance of the United States over the European sphere.
Yep.
Smith and Robinson.